October 1962. The world stood at the edge of nuclear war. The United States and the Soviet Union had spent 17 years locked in a dangerous standoff. Both sides possessed enough nuclear weapons to destroy civilization many times over. And in October 1962, the tension that had been building for years finally reached its breaking point. American spy planes had discovered Soviet nuclear missiles being installed in Cuba, just 90 miles from the American coast. President Kennedy demanded their removal. Soviet leader Khrushchev refused. The world held its breath. And in the depths of the Atlantic Ocean, a Soviet submarine carried a weapon that could have ended everything. The American Navy had been ordered to enforce a naval blockade around Cuba. Any Soviet vessel attempting to cross the blockade line would be stopped. The world watched as Soviet ships approached the line. Some turned back, but several Soviet submarines were already operating in the waters around Cuba, moving silently beneath the surface, unknown to the Americans above. And one of those submarines was about to become the most dangerous place on Earth. Submarine B-59 had been underwater for days. It was a Foxtrot-class submarine carrying a crew of 78 men, and it was carrying something else, a nuclear torpedo. A single weapon with the explosive power of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The submarine had lost contact with Moscow days earlier. The crew had no idea what was happening on the surface, no idea whether war had already broken out. The temperature inside the submarine had reached over 50 degrees Celsius. Men were fainting from heat exhaustion. The carbon dioxide levels were rising dangerously, and the situation was about to get much worse. American destroyers had detected B-59 and were dropping depth charges around it, not to destroy it, but to force it to surface. But the crew of B-59 did not know that. They could hear the explosions rocking their vessel. They had lost communication with Moscow. They did not know if the depth charges were the beginning of a war. The submarine's captain Valentin Savitsky was convinced war had started. He was exhausted, frightened, and furious. And he made a decision that could have ended the world. He ordered the nuclear torpedo to be prepared for launch. Under Soviet naval protocol at that time, launching the nuclear torpedo required the agreement of 3 senior officers on board. Captain Savitsky wanted to launch. The political officer Ivan Maslenikov agreed. 2 out of 3 had said yes. The nuclear torpedo was ready. The target would be the American ships above them. And if that torpedo had been launched, the United States would almost certainly have responded with its own nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union would have retaliated. And within hours, the world, as we know it, would have ceased to exist. Everything depended on the 3rd officer. The 3rd officer was a man named Vasili Arkhipov. He was the flotilla commander. Quiet, calm, thoughtful. A man who had already survived one nuclear near disaster the previous year when he was aboard a submarine during a reactor accident. He looked at his captain. He looked at the political officer. Both were exhausted and terrified and convinced that war had already begun. And Vasili Arkhipov said no. He refused to authorize the launch. He argued that they could not be certain war had started, that launching a nuclear weapon without confirmation from Moscow would be an act they could never take back. He stood firm, calmly, quietly, against 2 officers who outranked him in that moment, and he did not move. The argument inside that submarine lasted long enough for cooler heads to prevail. Captain Savitsky eventually agreed to surface the submarine rather than launch. B-59 rose to the surface surrounded by American warships. It was a tense and humiliating moment for the Soviet crew, but it was not a nuclear exchange. The torpedo was never launched. The war that would have killed hundreds of millions of people did not happen. Because one man in an overheated submarine in the Atlantic Ocean said no, and meant it. When surfaced, the American sailors on the surrounding ships had no idea how close they had just come to dying. They had no idea that below the surface a nuclear torpedo had been prepared for launch, that 2 officers had voted yes, that the world had been seconds away from catastrophe. They photographed the submarine, exchanged signals, and eventually B-59 was allowed to leave. The Cuban Missile Crisis was resolved diplomatically 13 days after it began. Soviet missiles were removed from Cuba. American missiles were quietly removed from Turkey, and the world breathed again, not knowing how close it had really come. While all of this was happening, ordinary people in America and the Soviet Union were going about their lives, shopping, working, taking their children to school, watching television, worried yes. The Cuban Missile Crisis was front-page news around the world, but they did not know about submarine B-59. They did not know about the nuclear torpedo. They did not know that a single officer's refusal was the difference between their world and its complete destruction. The full story of what happened inside B-59 was classified by the Soviet Union for decades. The world did not learn the truth until long after the Cold War had ended. Vasili Arkhipov returned to the Soviet Union after the crisis. He continued his naval career. He was never celebrated for what he had done, never publicly acknowledged. The Soviet government did not tell its people what had happened inside B-59. Arkhipov retired quietly. He died in 1998 at the age of 72. His wife Olga later said that he told her what had happened, that he carried it quietly for the rest of his life. In 2002, at a conference in Cuba, the full story of B-59 was finally revealed publicly. Thomas Blanton of the National Security Archive said that the world owes its survival to Vasili Arkhipov, a man whose name almost nobody knows. One man, one word, no. That is all that stood between October 1962 and the end of the world. Vasili Arkhipov did not consider himself a hero. He was simply a naval officer who believed that launching a nuclear weapon without certainty was wrong, and he was willing to stand alone in that belief against 2 officers who disagreed. He saved the world, and the world never knew his name. If this story moved you, subscribe to Echoes of the Dead, because history is full of names we were never taught, and this channel will never stop telling their stories.